Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, a primer on data security with SingleStore Managed Service. My name is Diogo, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, just a few logistical reminders. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you are currently in a listen-only mode. You may submit questions throughout the session using the Q&A function in the lower right corner of your console. We will answer everyone's questions after the presentation. After today's webinar, you will receive an email with the recording. If you wish to contact us, please email us at team@singlestore.com. So let me introduce our speakers today. Jake Bernardis is the Head of Information Security, and Micah Bhakti, the Director of Product Management at SingleStore. Welcome, Jake and Micah. You now have the floor.
Thanks. If the technology is working, then I'll be able to move through these slides while I have the deck separately. Let's see what happens. So just a quick introduction. Like I said, my name is Jake Bernardis. I've been at SingleStore for 18 months. I head up security, both physical, logical, and product security, and work closely with Micah, who helps enable those product ideas and concepts from a reality and a part of our product. We want to talk a little bit about security, both focused on our managed service, but also the kind of security landscape as a whole. How we've made decisions and what those decisions have been made on the basis of, and where those are leading us in the future. So without taking too long, I will skip through it and kind of look at the sections that we're going through. Firstly, why security matters. Our world has changed. I think security has come to the forefront. I think it's important to talk about why that's happened. Not just that it has happened, but understand a bit of the why. Why compliance matters, why it's no longer just about physical security, but about the wider compliance piece. What we at SingleStore do in response to the security requirements of our customers in relation to our products, what the future holds for SingleStore from a security stance, and then a Q&A for anyone who has any questions that they'd like to ask. So why does security actually matter? I think there's a number of things, and I picked a few images to try and draw on the importance of why this has become more relevant the last few years. It's inevitable now that if you turn to the news app, and as a Brit, I go to BBC News, and looking into that, there is always in the technology sector something relating to a data breach. If you scroll down maybe 2 or 3 past the first headlines, you'll find something on a data breach. And the reason is because, firstly, we started to care more about data. We've started to think more about our data. We've been driven to think more about what our data means and who has it and what they're doing with it. But also, more importantly, the way that we interact as businesses has become so much more complex. And one of the first examples I use is these 2 rock climbers. So I live on the edge of the Peak District here, on the edge of Sheffield in the north of England. And it's a really famous spot for rock climbers. I go out there and I ride bikes and I run quite a lot. And I see a lot of this. This is what's called B-lane. So what this means is that someone takes a fixed point in the rock face, posts a rope through it, and this woman here with the purple helmet is effectively giving tension or allowing that climber to climb by giving him what he needs and supporting him. And I use this as an example quite a lot when I talk about security, because historically all I cared about was SingleStore. I gave my product to a customer, they put it in their data center, it got secured, I went home. Things have changed dramatically. We now rely so much on third-party integrations. We rely so much on third-party vendors. We host our product in multiple cloud platforms. We rely on their security. We then have people who are part of our supply chains. All of these individual companies, these different entities are effectively providing B-lane to us. I can't control what they're doing. If I'm the man on the rock face here in the red trousers, I can't control the tension in that line. I'm relying on the person behind me, that supporting role, to give me that kind of control. And I think that when we talk about why security has become so important, it's simply around this fact. There are now so many entities, so many individuals, so many applications involved in the provision of a service that it's no longer simply about that product itself, but everything that goes behind it. And everyone has a part to play in making sure that you kind of keep continuity and keep security. This is inevitably an image which I think drives a lot of emotions in the technology sector, and it has certainly in the last 10 years. If you talk now about products, you cannot find anyone in Silicon Valley who doesn't have a product hosted in some form in a managed service. And that's simply because, firstly, because of scalability, but also because of how you can reduce CapEx costs and turn them into OpEx, how you can reduce the reliance on internal headcounts. Whatever you want to look at from the argument, all of our major customers are driving core workloads to the clouds, whether those are major financial institutions driving actual transactional processing, or healthcare providers with healthcare data, or whether that's PII going through for marketing or fintech. We see customers inevitably shifting all of their information to cloud workloads. And so what that means is then there's another section of reliance. If you look at my B-lane argument on the first slide, you've now got AWS, you've got GCP, you've got Azure, which are the big 3 players. who it's their platform. They basically built the foundation for me to build on top of. If there's security concerns there, then I've got a real security concern about what I build on top. And people are cognizant of this. People realize that we don't just provide everything, that we build as part of a layered system. And so questions get asked. The last one, inevitably the biggest one, is this. So the records stolen since 2013, and these represent individual records of data, sits at around 14 billion. The reason why that's interesting is it represents two core facts that have changed in the last 10 years. The first being the sheer volume of data. You'll hear multiple TED Talks, and I've stood up myself at DEF CON and various places and talked about how data doubles or quadruples or quintuples every year, right? These are all just numbers we pick out of a hat, but the reality is that data is increasing exponentially. The way that we live our lives is now becoming so much more data driven, from the way that we make decisions as businesses, to the way that we make purchases as individuals, to the way that we decide where we're going to drive or how we're going to get there. Everything is being driven by data that historically exists. And what we've realized is when there's more data, there's more opportunity for theft. First point. Second point is the value of data. So again, historically, when I started working in my industry, I came in as a pen tester or an ethical hacker. And what we used to do was work with banks to try and kind of untangle and reverse engineer how people were able to commit credit card fraud, how they were able to steal people's credit card details. They would then clone them and then spend their money. Now, this has changed massively in the last few years. Anyone who's ever lost their card, and I did personally, Orlando at Universal Studios, I lost my bank card once. It was a Chase card. I was moving between the Hulk ride to the Jurassic Park ride, for those who are aware of the relevance of where that distance is. And in that short time, I got a text from Chase telling me that my card had made a suspicious transaction, followed by another one telling me that my card had been cancelled, followed by another one telling me that the card was being issued to my new address, followed by another text that gave me a link to access through my Chase app that gave me a temporary payment card to use because they realized that I wasn't at my permanent residential address and I wouldn't get that card anytime soon. Right, that's clever. And the banks have got that smart. Amazon isn't. And that's not to pick on Amazon, but let's pick on eBay or Uber, whatever it might be. Anything where your bank card is tied to it, you can use that service and it doesn't recognize that I'm you. If I know your login credentials and your card happens to be attached to it, unless there's that odd chance, that unique moment when it asks for your security code, the 3-digit code in your card, which it doesn't often, then I can spend. I can send it to an Amazon Dropbox. I can go and pick it up in a hoodie and a balaclava, and you'll never know. And that's the reality, right? So now what's happened is that data that used to only have value when it was a credit card is no longer that way. Data that simply has a username and password for any service suddenly has value, because the chances are that you're lazy or that I'm lazy and that we reuse the same credentials repetitively. And what that means, if I get the ones that get to your email address, then automatically the first thing I do as an attacker is I do a password reset on every known service. And suddenly I've got the gold. I've got absolutely everything about you, right? So when we talk about why security suddenly matters now, it's because data is a lot more. It's a lot more in volume. It's a lot more in value. We're relying on third parties, both firstly in the clouds. We're driving our data to be on other people's systems. And then we're relying on lots of applications, integrations, and other third parties in a chain who are providing that tension in our rope in the belay example, who are part of our ecosystem. So compliance is another really interesting point. And I think the best way to highlight it is to talk about these. So a couple of our customers that are big and relevant. So Uber, everyone's heard of. We have a lot of tier 1 US banks, Comcast. We've got a lot of energy companies. We've got a lot of data companies like Akamai, people providing real-time analytics. We've got customers doing stuff with healthcare. We've got customers who have very sensitive data on vulnerable individuals, children or adults. We have multiple people who trust SingleStore to be the place where they put not just core, but highly sensitive workloads. And what we've seen now is that the security debate has become more about more than about your product. Again, when I kind of started seeing security, and this was a while ago, all we ever looked at was kind of how secure is the network and how secure is the product in its code. Take those two key components, one inside the other, and you've secured the thing. It doesn't work that way anymore. And I think a lot of this actually is probably driven, and I'm going slightly on a tangent, so forgive me, but it's driven a lot by the way that we start to interact with social media and social platforms. So if you talk about how we as a society has become much more divisive, particularly over the last 2 to 5 years, we've become put into a point where we're driven both by fake news and by real news to make very polarized decisions. And that's been the same about data. It's simply a case now that when something as a breach happens, SolarWinds or Equifax or Cathay Pacific or British Airways or many others we could name in the last 10 or 5 or even 1 year, When we talk about those, it goes social very quickly. And before you know it, they're not talking about how did the actual breach happen. They're talking about people in the business. They're talking about processes in the business. They're talking about things that are completely unrelated. And they're really digging down and drilling down. And so security has become a major part, not only of how you defend your product proactively, but how you also sell your product. It's not enough anymore to simply say my product has been pen tested and it's passed, and we've remediated anything that they found. That doesn't cop it anymore. The questions get asked are much deeper, and the reason is kind of this. I see this quite a lot. I'm a massive road bike nut. If I do any more webinars or presentations, I talk about this a lot. And so I've seen many bikes where this is all that's left. And the reason is the fact that when you secure a bike, it's about what is reasonable to do. This is the case of someone putting a lock through the front wheel. Often it's through the front wheel and the down tube of the frame, and then through a solid immovable object. The reality is that you can still steal most of the bike. Right? You're only securing a small portion. In this case, they only secured the front wheel and someone took everything. And if you look at a modern high-end road bike, there's a lot of value in someone stealing a large portion of your bike. And this is the same in an entity. When you secure the product, you secure the code, you secure the infrastructure on which it lies, then you are in a way only really securing the frame and the front wheel. You're not securing the rest of the business. Modern attackers and modern attack vectors don't go directly to networks and to code. They go through people, they go through process, they go through open old websites, they go through blogs that haven't been correctly updated and configured, they go through forums. They are finding multiple ways to actually get into a business and to move. And so what we're seeing is a real requirement, not just to demonstrate that the product is secure, but to demonstrate actually that the wider business is secure. And that's kind of the approach we've taken at SingleStore. So I joined the business about 18 months ago. I came from a consulting background, having worked for a lot of companies that most people have heard of, and providing these kind of services I do now to smaller growing entities who wanted to move from an immature to a mature posture. And so when the role came up to actually do it as a longer term role, I kind of jumped at the opportunity and saw what was effectively a clean field, if you like to say. So when I got to SingleStore, there was security built in from the product from the start, but the business in a wider perspective had never really been looked at. So we came in and built from the ground up, from policy, from process, from procedures, from laying applications like Okta, like MDM solutions, all these kind of layers of security that go on top that mean that not only is my actual core feature, my core product secure, but the way that my users inside the business and outside access us as people, as an entity, became more secure. We worked in line with SOC 2 and with ISO. We've just gone through the audit process and been pushed forward for certification. We had 0 findings on both of those. So we're awaiting the actual certificates themselves, which Mike has already mentioned he wants to put on the wall somewhere. Probably not in my house, I don't know, I'm looking at my walls. We also work towards a kind of comprehensive approach to privacy. So one of the benefits of SingleStore of having a European as a head of security is I understand GDPR. And so we made the business GDPR compliant from the ground up. And we've taken that as a real stance and a real, I suppose, proactive effort. We want to tell people that actually we care about this stuff enough that we're going to take everyone's data at the same highest value. And of course, in doing so, we meet the requirements of CCPA for the American West Coast. We've also worked on HIPAA compliance so that the product now can take healthcare workloads in the full managed service. And we've signed BAAs, or for those who understand, business associate agreements, meaning that we can now deal with US citizen healthcare data, which requires to be in compliance with the HIPAA guidelines. So yeah, we have taken a journey where we've gone beyond just simply the product and looked at the whole business holistically and how we can secure every single part of it. And we're looking at really making that, I suppose, home. When you look at kind of, I suppose if I think about my own house, this is probably a good way to think about it. What I've done is kind of put cameras and alarms at specific points of access. And then I've gone deeper to say if those points of access were breached, if there was a vulnerability there, then where would be the next point? And layered backwards up to the point that the people I care about know and understand how to use them, and therefore add a layer of human security at the same time. I'll hand over to Micah, who's much more of an expert in the granularity of the product, but will probably hand back to me at times and talk a little bit about how SingleStore itself does security.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So I wanted to kind of start out with talking about what we think security means to our customers, and then dig into how SingleStore has kind of built security into the platform from the ground up. When we started with this, we started by talking to our customers and looking at what was available in the market. A lot of our customers are, some of the most secure organizations in their fields and their respective verticals, and they have a lot of experience working with security. And so that was a big part of kind of informing our approach. And then we wanted to look at it from the perspective of what the need was from a user of SingleStore, and then trace that back to the technology that we would implement in order to provide that, rather than starting with the technology and then hoping that we get to an endpoint that provides value to the customer. So when we started building our managed service, we not only wanted to kind of adhere to the security standards and implement the technologies that it would take to create a secure platform, but we wanted to understand, what do customers need in terms of, thinking about security everywhere. And that's authentication, and it's encryption in transit, and it's encryption at rest. How are customers thinking about GDPR and CCPA and requirements around data management and data governance? And then what is the benefit of shifting kind of the risk liability to SingleStore? Our customers know that they need to be secure with the data that they store within SingleStore, but they don't necessarily want to manage all the compliance and the process around that. And so if we could make that easier with SingleStore Managed Service to shift that responsibility onto SingleStore, that results in the customer being able to be more agile while still having a peace of mind that their data was secure. And one other benefit of kind of shifting the responsibility of security to SingleStore was we were able to eliminate certain vectors of threat on the customer's data. So insider threats is one of the big potential risk vectors anytime a customer is implementing a data strategy. But because of the SingleStore practice of vetting our employees and going through strict compliance reviews and pen testing, we're able to kind of shift that burden to SingleStore, but also eliminate potential risks that a customer would have if they were implementing the infrastructure on their own with software and managing the cloud provider themselves. So this is kind of the starting place on thinking about how customers were thinking about security and what they wanted to get out of the security, and then taking that to the next level of how do we implement this in the platform. So when we look at the core security features that we built into the SingleStore Managed Service from the start, the first one is around encryption of data. And we wanted to have a platform that provided encryption both in transit and at rest, right? When you're connecting to the SingleStore database, you need to make sure that nobody else is seeing the information that you're putting into the database or retrieving from it. We do that through authentication and encryption using TLS SSL. And then we also wanted to make sure that once the data was in SingleStore, it was always secured at rest. And so we do that by deeply integrating with the cloud providers' encryption for storage, and encrypting everything with AES 256 to make sure that as soon as the data is stored within SingleStore, it's always going to be secure. We've also, as Jake mentioned, we've gone through compliance certification for SOC 2 and ISO 27001. We're able to store HIPAA compliant data within SingleStore. And this was a big importance for us when we built the platform, because we know a lot of the customers using SingleStore have these types of workloads and have mission critical data that they can't put in any other database. They need to store that in SingleStore for performance or low latency or parallel access and concurrency. But they also need to make sure that the data is secure when they're accessing it. And then the last element that we really focused on was transparent auditability. And so when a customer is using SingleStore, you want full visibility of everything that's happening in the cluster. Oftentimes there's multiple applications and multiple reporting streams that are all working off that data. And you need to make sure from an internal compliance perspective that you have full visibility to all of those actions. And by the same measure, because SingleStore is managing the cluster and managing the infrastructure for you, you also want to make sure that you have full auditability of anything SingleStore does. So, if a support engineer needs to access the cluster, that's granted by the customer, and those activities are fully auditable. So you never have to worry about anything happening with the cluster where you don't have full visibility and transparency of those actions. There's also a few things that we're kind of building into the platform going forward. And I wanted to talk on just a couple of those elements that are coming into SingleStore Managed Service and will kind of further extend our security posture. We're shortly going to be introducing dedicated deployments. So these are fully isolated single tenant deployments of SingleStore Managed Service. And these meet the highest levels of compliance and kind of secure regulated industries for some of our most regulated and most secure customers. And so we're going to be making those available this summer, and working with some of our key partners to deploy their most critical infrastructure in SingleStore managed service with those dedicated deployments. We're also introducing a new feature which we call point-in-time restore, and this provides data protection. So point-in-time restore allows you to kind of reattach a database from a previous point in time. So if you have an application that writes bad data over good data, or if you have a user that's connecting to the database and makes unauthorized changes, you can reattach the database from a previous point in time, and you have full protection for your data against unexpected writes or access. We're adding SingleStore single sign-on for our portal in order to authenticate users, and we'll be providing access with Okta and Azure AD through technologies like SAML in order to authenticate all your users to the portal management plane for managed service coming in the winter timeframe. And then lastly, we're working on implementing customer managed keys for the storage encryption at rest. All of our data is encrypted, and those keys are rotated regularly, but we also want to give customers the ability to kind of manage those keys themselves so that they can rotate those keys or drop those keys based on their internal compliance requirements. And so all of these things are kind of coming into the managed service platform over the next several quarters in order to really extend the capability of security in the platform, and make sure that even for the most mission critical workloads our customers have, they can always trust their data in the SingleStore managed service.
Thanks, Mike. I think just kicking back through some of these, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of give a head of security perspective on why some of these matter. I think on this slide there are kind of key topics behind each of these. Secure Anywhere really, to me, speaks about the fact that it gives me comfort and confidence that the product functions the same where I put it. If our business decides, as a buyer, if our business decides they want to move to Azure or to GCP, or they want to go on-prem, or they want to go back to AWS, the fact that we build a product which is inherently secure regardless of the infrastructure that it sits on gives me a lot of comfort and confidence that I can put my workloads wherever suits the business best, from either from a cost or an architectural perspective, and feel happy and comfortable with those decisions. The GDPR and data privacy thing is becoming more and more of a thing, particularly in Europe. And how we do facilitate that is obviously we give the DBAs who have access to our product full capability to be able to pull, delete, to port, to move, to alter records. But we also have support engineers who understand the processes and compliance underpins these to help and guide if that's required. Insider threats is always going to be the biggest challenge of any industry. If you look at some of the most interesting data breaches in the last 10 years, they happened from people who worked for AWS or Azure or GCP, who had access to overarching layers of infrastructure. So what we're really doing is making sure that we know our people. Our SRE team is small and intimate, and we happen to know them inside out, where they came from, how they think, what they do. We review them regularly from an access and from a behavioral perspective, and make sure that all their actions are thoroughly logged, that there's almost a motive addressable and understandable from those log pieces. And risk liability is a brilliant one, right? So as any head of security or CISO knows, that the moment you can shift the liability for a breach to somebody else gives you a lot more happiness and a lot more peace and sleep at night. And so when we talk to customers, one of the reasons they're looking at using our managed service is that it moves the risk liability from them to me in this case. And so what you've got then is a real comfort of the business, and actually they're putting their core workloads, not just in their own data center, with their own people, with another business who specifies and who specializes in having that type of data in this type of environment with the right skill set to make sure we can both secure it and actually look after it, right? So that's really key and important. Then if we talk a bit about how and when, I think authentication and encryption are always the key topics that come up for every customer. The way we authenticate and the way we use IP whitelisting simply means the fact that if you don't have delegated access to the product from the person who bought it in your business or from us, then you can't get on to any of it. Meaning that it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for it to be a malicious outsider or a malicious attacker that you don't know, because they constantly get there. Data is obviously encrypted in transit and rest, as is completely normal and expected now, and it has to be. The compliance which we talked about. And then for me personally, I'm a big advocate for transparent security. Rather than often locking everything down, it's more about actually allowing people to understand your processes, your logic, and the way that you make decisions. And so what we're trying to do is open up as much as humanly possible to what our SREs do in a product at a time when something falls down, to how they do it, to who approved it, to why they did it, to why they approved it, to give you full availability to actually understand not just what happened, but the motive and logic behind it. And I think that's where a lot of the industry is going, is to kind of give this true transparency to a managed service application. And I think when you talk about these, what makes me excited is dedicated gives the opportunity for customers to really do things which is very hard to do in a purely managed service. In a dedicated environment, you can start to talk about compliance requirements for PCI, for FedRAMP, for all kinds of quite sophisticated and quite specific workloads. And that gives us a whole other reach to kind of go after. I think the PITR becomes very important, the fact that you can actually recover data from any moment, that if there is the instance where an incident happens, whether it's security or just architecture related, the fact that you can go back to specific points, that's where I want to recover from and recover from it, that's a really powerful feature. Single sign-on, delegated or federated auth is really important. We use it inside our business. I know many, many people who also do. Things like Okta, Ping ID, other applications are also out there as well, that we can put that in front of our application. So actually, you don't need to worry about people having username and password credentials here. They have to first authenticate through Okta to get there, which might be controlled by biometric, as mine is, right? And then custom managed encryption gives a whole other layer of security again, moving away from the conversation that says that actually we have the encryption keys in the end and we could decipher your data, to the point that says that actually you own the encryption keys. If you are worried specifically, and most customers aren't, but if you are worried specifically about who owns those keys, who has the power to decrypt the data, then you have them. And I think that gives us a whole another layer of security to talk about in any dialogue or conversation. That's the point at which I think me and Micah had our information too. If people want to ask any questions, then please feel free to on any topic that might be relevant or useful. Micah, what do you think are some of the key questions that we get asked most often by customers in terms of current product challenges or kind of future developments?
Yeah, so usually where we start with customers is an engagement around how SingleStore is built and what we provide in terms of security. Customers want to kind of understand the security posture of SingleStore. And we actually have some materials that I know you've kind of driven and built out together with the team that we have available that kind of makes it clear what SingleStore provides. I think usually customers dig into, one, connecting their applications to SingleStore and how to make sure that that's secured and the connection between, their local VPC or their infrastructure that they're running, and that between that and the managed service is kind of secured and encrypted. The other thing, customers are looking at is just auditability and long-term kind of visibility of what's happening in the cluster, what's being done, and especially around, the operations. SingleStore managed service is fully automated, obviously, and so the infrastructure management is all handled by us. And so customers just want to make sure that they have good visibility of that. So features like our audit logging and integrations with notifications and things like that help customers to kind of understand the state of the cluster at any point in time. So those are probably the most common things. Some less common things are around data protection of certain types of secure data, and also internal kind of compliance regulations that they may have specific to their organization. I don't know if you have any experiences from kind of interfacing with compliance groups at some of our larger customers, and where the discussion's gone on that.
I think the most common question that comes up is always about who can access the data, who can do what, when will they do it, how will they do it, and why will they do it. There's always been a sensitivity in the database world around SREs, the site reliability engineers, and their kind of access levels. And I think it becomes a really difficult and interesting debate. And if I get in front of my soapbox for a minute, you'll get one school of thought that talks about the fact that we should limit back access to make it virtually impossible for an SRE or for anyone in support to be able to see the data or do anything with it, to be able to replicate data, to be able to replicate an issue. The problem that you then run into is you run into functionality issues where if you can't see or replicate issues that have been created, then you can't look how to debug them. And suddenly it becomes a lot slower in terms of moving and addressing or fixing issues. I think the more common school of thought, and the one that I kind of adhere to, is the fact that what we actually need to do is just open up a lot more transparency, give people a lot more clarity in terms of not just the fact that, okay, SRE A entered the database and looked at this, ran this query and will have seen these results at this time, but let's look at actually, okay, so why did they do that? Can we show in a log how that tracks back to a support ticket? Who raised that support ticket to the customer? Can we then show how that SRE was told that this was okay to do? Because we have a process in place that says if you're going to access end user data, you need approval to do it. So is that approval then able to be shown? So we get to a point where our log is not a kind of traditional system log. It just says this happened, this was the event, but starts to be more holistic and starts to actually understand and underpin the rationale behind the fact that a customer first of all raised and said, I've got this issue, and what went on between all those steps before the SRE here actually looked into data. That's the most common thing. I think the common conversation we're having. There'd be common ones around encryption. I think that also is very much a two-tier system. Most customers we look at are quite happy with the fact if it's encrypted, it ticks the box in their procurement chain, and that's fine. Then we have a deep level of customer, more often in the financial industry, who wants to have ownership of the encryption themselves, and that's where kind of dedicated clusters come into play, but also in the future, fully KMS or customer managed keys comes in. We have then some odd or more interesting queries out there, stuff around secure enclaves, so kind of bleeding edge tech in the database space. How do you encrypt and secure at a kernel level effectively, which requires some very specific hardware, which is often quite hard to do in a managed service or in any environment, in fact, because it requires to upgrade the latest and greatest Ice Lake Intels, which is quite rare to see these days. So I think that what you see from the larger customers is a conversation around access and encryption. But what you see from the smaller customers is simply a fact that they want to get assurance and comfort that you have a safe pair of hands in charge.
Where's the best place for folks to go if they want to find out more details or engage with SingleStore and kind of a discussion about their specific workloads and the security needs that they have based on those workloads?
So singlestore.com/security has all of our security stuff. It provides all the links. It talks about all of our security product features. It talks about our certification journey. It tracks to various documentation, both at a technical level or more at a kind of higher level, so depending on kind of what you're coming from, what kind of direction you're coming from. And then what we do again is we use a product in a company called Wistic, who are based out of Salt Lake City, who provide effectively what I like to think of as kind of a LinkedIn profile for the business from a security perspective. And we open that up to anyone who asks for it. And that allows them to look at all of our policies, all of our procedures, all of the audits we've done internally and externally, all of our pen test results. Like, we open this up to anybody. And so when I said earlier, I'm an advocate for transparent security, I really kind of practice what I preach. And so, yeah, I think the first instance is to go to singlestore.com/security. The second is through that you can raise a contact. And if you really want to get more granular detail, you can either ask me direct questions or you can request access to our Wistic, and then you can have a look in there and really see all of the documentation, the procedures which underpin a lot of what we do.
Yeah, that sounds great. We also have, with our managed service, obviously we have a free trial. We give people $500 to use the managed service and test it out with their workloads. And we've got directly in the product, you can always reach out to an engineer, and it'll go directly to a technical contact that can help with support questions. So if you do have questions about, how it's secured, the level of encryption, authentication, things like that, in the product, you can load up Intercom and communicate with an engineer, or you can reach out to our engineering team directly and get help on addressing specific security concerns that you have.
We're also, I think, a very available company. Like, both of our names are our names that you'll find in LinkedIn. And not hard to work out my email from it is jbernadez, and you're welcome to reach out at any point and ask any questions. I'm always happy to field questions that our customers, potential customers, or anyone also in the developer space has.
Thank you, Jake and Micah. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We will send you a follow-up email with today's recording and a link to our managed service free trial. We are offering each user a $500 in credit so you can start a full workload today. Lastly, check out our other virtual events at singlestore.com. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day.